Hi everybody, if you fly by Akasa, SpiceJet or Air India Express, you need to watch this episode very carefully because Boeing aircrafts are in trouble. 5 years back, if you remember, 2 Boeing aircrafts crashed out of nowhere and sparked the biggest controversy of the decade.
An Indonesia passenger plane crashing into the sea minutes after takeoff.
5 months later, the Ethiopian Airlines flight plunged into the ground.
Safety is at the core of who we are at Boeing.
346 people were killed in 2 plane crashes.
So 5 months, 2 major crashes and 1 plane.
Both these aircrafts were Boeing 737 MAX and both of them crashed due to the manufacturing defect of Boeing. And while most of us thought it to be yet another tragic incident, what we don't realize is that Boeing aircrafts are still experiencing disastrous incidents that will traumatize you forever. Look at this. In January, their door plug just blew off and then they found loose bolts on their door plugs. And then a month later, an aircraft tire fell off and a Boeing aircraft even reported a fuel leak. Now imagine if you're 30,000 feet above the ground and your pilot tells you that your fuel is leaking, how would you feel? Imagine that you are just about to land and you see your landing tire just fall off. How would you feel? Scary as hell, right? Well, unfortunately, this is what is happening to Boeing. In the past 10 years, Boeing has seen 970 cases, which has now put one of the greatest companies in human history on the verge of bankruptcy.
Boeing's best-selling plane is coming under increased scrutiny after another deadly accident.
I hear this boom. I look to my left and part of the plane is gone.
Every time it seemed like Boeing was just around the corner, then, a new issue cropped up.
Now, there are passengers who avoid or are scared to get on Boeing airplanes.
Boeing is now a dreaded name in the world of aviation.
But the key question, the multi-billion-dollar question is, when does the yacht clear? And we just don't know yet.
And you know what is the shocking fact of all, guys? Once upon a time, Boeing was by far the most reliable, the most trusted, and the most innovative brand in the world for 80 long years. In fact, Boeing was so trusted that people used to say, if it ain't Boeing, I ain't going.
747 was very much a commitment to the future of air transport beyond the wildest dreams of anybody else at that time in the industry.
We've been the technology leader in aviation in the world. Boeing was a magnificent company who made, in my opinion, the best airplanes in the world.
There was a time when people said, if it's not Boeing, I'm not going.
But after doing so well for 80 years, the business leaders of Boeing made one big mistake. And this mistake changed the fortunes of the company from a dream run to a nightmare. And the reason why this case study is very important for us is because as entrepreneurs, this mistake is by far the biggest and the most common mistake that we all must avoid. The question is, how did Boeing become the most successful company on earth only to become the biggest failure of the century? What exactly did the leaders of Boeing do wrong because of which they lost their reputation of 80 years with just this one mistake? And most importantly, what are the lessons that we need to learn from the disastrous fall of Boeing? Before we move on, I want to quickly thank our knowledge partners of today's episode, and that is Paytm. If you're a 90s kid, you know the pain behind the statement, change nahi hai, right? Every time you visited any shop or vendor, they said this, and after that, they would give you chocolates for the rest of the amount, or they would ask you to get change. But look at the Indian markets now, how things have changed. Now, everyone has exactly the same amount, all thanks to Paytm par 50 rupaye prapt hue. Every shop or vendor has a soundbox that says Paytm karo. Even the man that I buy coconut water from uses Paytm, and that tells us what a revolution online payment has brought to India. And the Paytm soundbox is one of the most amazing inventions of all. Imagine having multiple customers at the same time in your shop. How will you track their payment? Here's where Paytm's soundbox replaces the need for a chotu announcing every payment received with ease. And this makes business smoother than ever. From offline to digital payments, from queues to quick taps, Paytm is empowering millions one payment at a time. And that is why they say Paytm is made in India, made for India. To understand the fall of Boeing, we first need to understand that there are 2 philosophies of running a business. And this is one of the most important things that even my billionaire guests have told me at the podcast. So listen to these lines very carefully. You could either be a product-driven business or a business-driven business. Now, most of you will call me crazy and say, bro, what are you saying? Every business is a business-driven business. How does that make any sense at all? Well, let us understand this using the example of Apple. When Steve Jobs was building Apple from 1976 to 1985, Apple was a product-driven business. They built one of the finest computers the world had ever seen. But you know what? Behind the scenes, they did the most illogical things that an MBA would never do. Because whatever they did not make any business sense at all. For example, back then, people did not care about how the computers were packaged. So the standard practice was to use a metal or wooden casing. But Steve Jobs cared so much that he spent several months into just finding a polished plastic casing. Why? Because he wanted the computer to look beautiful. While everybody was focused on just growing their sales, Steve Jobs was obsessed with something as simple as a user manual. Because he said, if anyone gets their Apple computer, they should be able to use it right away. So he spent hours into just making the perfect user manual, into just making the user manual look beautiful. All these decisions led to slowed production, increased cost, and made Apple II so expensive that it was double the price of its competitors. But guess what? Steve Jobs never cared. And you know, when Steve Jobs launched the iPhone in January 2007, he had already announced that the products would be shipped in June 2007. So only 5 months were left to ship the product to the customers. So by this time, the factory was ready, the raw materials were decided, the design was finalized, and the iPhones were just about to get manufactured. But you know what, guys? Just after the presentation, Steve Jobs comes backstage and tells Tim Cook that, Tim, listen, I used this iPhone prototype for a few weeks and this iPhone has scratches. So we need to change the screen because we cannot have a screen that gets scratches. And you know what? Tim was shocked. Tim said, but Steve, we are just about to start production. How can we just change the screen? Steve said, I don't know, Tim, we just have to do it. Now, if you speak to any product designer or manufacturer, they will tell you that nobody in their right mind would try to change anything at this point, because changing the screen of 1.4 million iPhones is not a joke. It would cost profits, it would put the hard work of thousands of people at risk, and most importantly, back then, nobody produced scratch-proof glass screens in the world. But you know what they did? Just a few weeks before launch, the entire Apple team went looking for someone who can make a better glass. And in these few weeks, they found a company, they found a factory in China that could cut the glass, they partnered with the company, hired 8,700 mid-level engineers and started manufacturing iPhones with a scratch-free screen. And that is how, ladies and gentlemen, the world saw the rise of Gorilla Glass.
Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
This glass is pretty strong. It's damage resistant. One of the fastest developments that we've ever pulled off here, and a very successful one.
Steve Jobs asked for the impossible, turned something fragile into something indestructible.
Steve Jobs made a call to the CEO of Corning and asked the company to create glass that could withstand scratches and breakage for a new Apple product. Corning quickly developed Gorilla Glass, and it's been used on every iPhone since.
So Apple replaced the plastic screen with Gorilla Glass in just 150 days and shipped 1.4 million iPhones that did not get scratched. 4 years later, Apple sold 200 million iPhones.
We think there are going to be several 100,000 people lined up Friday night and Saturday morning just to have the first one.
This phone brings pleasure, and that should count.
We think 1 million phones will be flying out the door that first weekend.
I'm buying $100,000 worth of iPhones.
Well, stocks surged while competitors, including the BlackBerry's manufacturer, were hit hard.
Now, if you look at it from a business standpoint, Steve Jobs did not have to do this because the investors and customers would have never noticed. And had they rolled out the Gorilla Glass in the next version of the iPhone, it would have been great because that would have been a great selling point to sell more iPhones. But Steve Jobs said, no means no. Apple cannot ship junk. Product comes first, revenue, profit, shareholders, everything comes next. This is how, ladies and gentlemen, for the longest time, Steve Jobs maintained Apple as a product-driven business and not as a business-driven business. So when you're a product-driven business, every single decision of yours is meant to build a great product, even if that means decreasing your profits, even if that means losing shareholder value, even if that means taking up debt and incurring losses. Because this philosophy says that until you build a great product, everything will be stacked against you. But when you build a formidable product for the world, you can beat all the odds in the market. Whereas in a business-driven business, the leaders will always tell you whatever makes the revenue grow, whatever increases profit, whatever increases shareholder value, that is what you got to do. Then it doesn't really matter how good or average your products are. If you understand this, you will understand the case of Boeing better. So if this is very, very clear to you, let's jump into the story of Boeing. People, Boeing was one of the most revolutionary companies in the history of the world. It started in 1916. They supplied aircrafts to the US Navy during World War I, and that is how the founder William Boeing got rich.
When the Boeings of the world came into aviation, he is thinking, what can we use this for?
Boeing's first customer was the United States military.
The company continued to attract orders for fighter and military training aircraft.
Boeing introduced the Model 80. It was the first Boeing aircraft designed with passengers in mind. Bill Boeing and the men and women who built the company with him saw a grand opportunity.
Boeing flew its first commercial airplane in 1933, and by 1958, Boeing delivered the first US-made commercial jetliner called the Boeing 707. Boeing was so far ahead as compared to its competition that in the 1970s, while Airbus 300 could carry 247 passengers for a non-stop distance of 4,600 miles, McDonnell Douglas DC-10 could carry 220 passengers for a non-stop distance of 3,800 miles, and Lockheed's TriStar could carry 400 passengers for 4,600 miles. Whereas Boeing 747 was so far ahead of its competition that it could carry 460 passengers and fly 9,200 miles non-stop. And the fundamental reason why Boeing was so good was because it was run by a bunch of engineering nerds who only wanted to build the best products in the world, even if that meant less profits, even if that meant taking the company on the verge of bankruptcy. Yes, you heard that right. Boeing engineers even took the company on the verge of bankruptcy just to build a great product. And the classic story of such an insane product obsession is the story of Boeing's billion-dollar bet in 1965. Back in 1965, Boeing generated a revenue of $2 billion. And even though they had a great year to register profits, you know what they did? They poured in more than $1 billion into building an aircraft called the Boeing 747.
Boeing 747, the world's first wide-bodied jet. So wide, the Wright brothers' historic flight was shorter than its wingspan.
Quantum leap in technology of that airplane was just extraordinary.
And it was much more than just a big aircraft.
This airplane allowed every person on Earth the opportunity to get an airplane and fly anywhere else.
It was a billion-dollar gamble that stretched technology to the limit. It became an icon, the most recognized aircraft in the world.
So they put in more than half of their revenue into just building a new product. Now you might say, bro, so what? That's called research and development. Well, this is why, ladies and gentlemen, you need to know how incredibly difficult the aircraft manufacturing space is. Did you know, unlike a phone company or a car company, where you can expect some output for your investment into R&D, in aviation, even if you spend $1 billion, there is absolutely zero guarantee that you will be able to build a successful product. And even after you start spending that money, it might take you anywhere between 5 to 10 years to even attempt to build a single product. In fact, even after spending 5 years and more than $1 billion, there is a possibility that your model of aircraft will never get made at all. And after making the aircraft also, it is very, very difficult to break even. For example, when Boeing designed the new 787, they spent $32 billion on it. You know how much money that is? That is 12.54 times the profit of Reliance Industries and 8.38 times the profit of Tata Motors. So after spending $32 billion, they then had to sell 1,100 aircrafts just to break even. You know how big a fleet of 1,100 aircrafts would be? As of December 2023, the entire Indian market, which includes Indigo, Vistara, SpiceJet, Air India, all of them combined, they only had 771 aircrafts. So Boeing had to sell 1.4 times the size of the entire aviation fleet of India just to break even. This is how difficult it is to build and sell an aircraft. But even then, back in 1965, Boeing spent more than 50% of its $2 billion in revenue into just building the Boeing 747. It took them 28 months and 4,500 engineers to build it. But when they did, they built it so well that from 1970 to 2007, that is for 37 years, the Boeing 747 remained the largest passenger aircraft ever. And the reason why Boeing was so successful for 70 years was because it was a company that was run by engineers, and these engineers had the ultimate power of saying yes or no while building the products. In fact, even the executives of Boeing had such a solid research background that they held patents, they had designed wings, and they always put safety standards ahead of profits and shareholder value. And because they were so product obsessed and they built the best products in the world, if you look at their numbers, they were always shooting up. From 1975 to 1995, the stock price of Boeing shot up by 4,400% from $0.4 a share to $18 a share. The revenue shot up from $3.92 billion to $19.52 billion, and profit shot up from $102 million to $393 million. This is when Boeing was one of the most profitable, innovative, and one of the most formidable companies on the face of Earth.
Boeing had record orders for its Dreamliner, 300 planes valued at over $42 billion.
Boeing emerged as a key innovator in jet technology and commercial aviation. The company pursued growth through partnerships, acquisitions, and by navigating international competition. Suddenly, air travel was within reach for almost everybody.
Then the question over here is, when Boeing was so successful and so profitable, what exactly went wrong? Well, the story of the fall of Boeing started in 1996. This is when there were three players in the market: Airbus, Boeing, and another company called McDonnell Douglas. While Boeing had 53% market share, Airbus had 18% and McDonnell had 19%. So to consolidate the market, Boeing acquired this company called McDonnell Douglas for $13 billion. And this is where the problem started. When they acquired the company, the CEO of McDonnell was a man named Harry. And somehow, Mr. Harry negotiated a merger with Boeing in such a way that he became the president and chief operating officer of the merged entity and a member of Boeing's board. So you see what happened? A big company bought a small company, but the small company CEO became the head of the large company. So you know what happened next? All the McDonnell Douglas teams started to take charge of the production and design department of Boeing. After taking over, they started breaking down the teams of Boeing into separate outsourced teams in Japan, Malaysia, and Italy. For example, in Boeing 787's Dreamliner program, Boeing outsourced its operation to Japanese companies like Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, and Fuji Heavy. So these companies made 35% of the aircraft's structure. Similarly, Italian companies like Eliana Aeronautica were tasked with the assembly of the mid-section and rear section of the fuselage. And for 737, they started to have its operation in Malaysia, where they had more supplier relations. Now the question over here is, why did Boeing suddenly start breaking down and outsourcing its operation? Well, that is because when they outsourced their operation to Japan, they started to get large orders from Japanese companies like All Nippon Airways and Japan Airlines. So it's like US companies outsourcing their business to India so that they can get Indian clients in return for their relationship with India. So this looks like a fantastic business decision, right? Outsourcing cuts cost, and in return for outsourcing, Boeing was able to get new customers. So you know what? Boeing decided to outsource 70%. I repeat, 70% of its design, engineering, and manufacturing of entire modules to over 50 strategic partners all across the world. Looks fantastic, right? But guess what? Instead of making the operations simpler, this outsourcing complicated the matters to such an extent that there were too many faults in the procedure, too many engineering problems occurred, and eventually the budget allocated for 787 shot up from $18 to $20 billion to $32 billion. So because of some stupid business outsourcing strategy, Boeing had to spend another $12 billion extra. And at the same time, from 1999 to 2003, Boeing laid off more than 50,000 employees for cost cutting.
Boeing announced on Wednesday it's cutting over 12,000 U.S. jobs, with more on the way.
Boeing employees are expected to be back on the job after the Machinists Union overwhelmingly ratifies a deal to end an 8-week strike. The labor group says the new contract protects more than 5,000 factory jobs while preventing the outsourcing of certain positions and preserving healthcare benefits.
And to make matters worse, instead of using the existing money to build better and newer products, Boeing engaged in another healthy business practice. You know what they did? Between 1998 and 2018, Boeing bought back shares worth $61 billion. I repeat, $61 billion, which was literally 81.8% of their profits. Why did they do that? Because Boeing wanted to increase their earnings per share. In simple words, if you have $100 in profit and you have 100 outstanding shares, then your earnings per share is $1 per share. But if you buy back 50 of these shares, then the outstanding shares would be 50 and the profit would still be $100, right? So now the earnings per outstanding share would be $2 per share, right? So in the stock market, when the earnings per share goes up, the investors would see the stock as more valuable. So yes, Boeing spent $61 billion just to make Boeing stocks look more lucrative for the shareholders. And to make matters worse, while they were taking these business decisions, Boeing's entire headquarters and senior management was moved 2,000 miles away from the commercial aircraft division. So now the management and the engineering team were far away from each other. So again, quality checks, innovation and research, everything took a backseat. This is how Boeing's business leaders used healthy business practices to lay the foundation for Boeing's failure. And guess what? The story doesn't end here. While Boeing was spending its $61 billion into a useless stock buyback, something crazy was happening with Airbus. American Airlines until 2011, for 15 long years, they had bought only from Boeing. But because Airbus was coming up with more efficient aircrafts, they placed an order with Airbus. This is when Boeing got a wake-up call. Boeing knew that they were falling behind and their planes were no longer the best quality or of the best efficiency. So you know what they did? Instead of cutting down on the buyback and investing that money into building new products, they took a shortcut. Instead of spending $20 billion on a new project, they spent just $2.5 billion to tweak their existing design of 737 and called it 737 MAX. So, do you see the difference? A few decades back, the same company did not think twice before pumping in 50% of its revenue into building a new product. But now, the same company spent 81% of its profits into buyback and did cost cutting with product development. And since they were operating out of FOMO, Boeing decided to fast track this entire process. And in this fast tracking, they made one big mistake. To tell you about it, when you build a new product in the aircraft industry, it takes 5 to 9 years just for certification. And obviously, Boeing could not wait that long. So in their way to hack the process of certification, they used the same parts of the 737 and just attached new engines. So this way, their customers, which were airline companies, they could use the same staff and same pilots with some minor additional training. And the hack was that since the Federal Aviation Association had already certified the 737, the modified 737 MAX would get certified easily. That is how Boeing 737 MAX, or the modified version of Boeing, went for certification. And not so surprisingly, without a mandatory simulator training, the Boeing 737 MAX was approved. And while everyone thought Boeing had not made any major changes to the aircraft, they sneaked in one change that even the pilots were not aware of. To tell you about it, while Boeing made modifications to the 737, they used a larger engine. And this engine was placed a little forward, which lifted the nose of the plane while it was mid-air. This was because this change in engine placement affected the aerodynamics of the plane. So to counter this, they introduced something called maneuvering characteristics augmentation systems. In short, if the nose of the plane went too high, the MCS would automatically push the nose down. And guess what? In both the flights that crashed, as soon as the flight took off, this MCAS system pushed the nose down. In fact, a report on Lion Air crash showed that the sensor made the plane's nose go downwards 26 times. And during this time, the pilots struggled to pull the nose up for 10 minutes, but eventually they lost control and the flight crashed. And the most shocking fact of all is that the pilots could have switched off the MCA system, right? Well, guess what? The pilots didn't even know this system existed in the first place. Why? Because Boeing thought they were not making any major changes. As a result, no training was given to the pilots to deal with MCAS, and they didn't even inform the pilots about MCAS in the manual. This is how those two aircrafts crashed, eventually leading to a full-blown investigation into Boeing. And as they dug deeper and deeper, they found out that in the race of becoming more profitable, in the race of looking better for the shareholders, Boeing made such terrible changes that eventually it caused them such heavy losses that today they neither have profits nor do they have their share values going up. In fact, in the past 5 years, Boeing stock price has gone down by 49%. And what's even sad is that in the past 10 years, there have been 970 incidents in Boeing all across the world, which shows how consistently they've been failing. This is the tragic story of Boeing that went from being the most trustworthy aircraft manufacturer in the world to becoming a victim of its MBA leadership. And this brings us to the last part of the episode, and that are the business lessons that we need to learn from the fall of Boeing. Lesson number 1. As an entrepreneur, you always have to decide whether you are going to be a product-driven business or a business-driven business. And trust me, history is telling us that if we build products only to increase profits and revenue, it is the perfect recipe for disaster. So build great products and let the numbers be the byproduct of great products. Lesson number 2. Culture in any organization is of utmost importance, and if there is a disconnect between the management and the workers, again, it's a perfect recipe for failure. So always ask yourself whether your management team is working closely with your product team or is it working against your product team. Because this is where the problem starts. It happened with Apple, it happened with Starbucks, and it happened with Boeing. So there is no reason why your company is immune to this virus. And lastly, always remember, in business, there is a thin line between cost cutting and compromise. If you cut costs, it will help you grow your business. But if you compromise, your fall will be inevitable. This is what we need to learn from the tragic fall of Boeing. That's all from my side for today, guys. If you learned something valuable, please make sure to hit the like button in order to make YouTube Baba happy. And for more such insightful business and political case studies, please subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.